Hello, I'm Cecilia Garibay, Co-Principal Investigator of CASE. I want to welcome you to Day 2 of the 2021 AISL Awardee meeting. Throughout today's sessions, we will consider the theme of research and knowledge building, starting with the plenary, Rethinking Rigor, Considering Racism and Colonialism in ISE Research and Evaluation Approaches.
Hi, everybody, and welcome. My name is Martin Storkstick. I'm also a co-principal investigator for CASE, and I'm at Oregon State University. And I just want to reflect briefly that we had a very rich conversation yesterday about partnerships that led to great conversations during the day. I want to remind us all of our community norms, making sure we give place and space for everybody, and bringing ourselves in our authentic way, and check ourselves in terms of who is in the room, making space for everyone. And with that, we're looking forward to an exciting day, building on yesterday and on the plenary that's following. And with that, I'll hand it over to Professor Megan Bang to kick us off for the plenary.
I'm so sorry that I'm on my phone. I had an electrical fire in my house and had to change very quickly. So just apologies for that. I just want to start by really welcoming everyone to this session and telling you how excited I am to learn with these four fabulous folks and the work that they're doing. And what we're going to do today is really, I'm actually not going to introduce everyone. I'm going to let them introduce themselves very briefly, and we're going to dive in. And one of the things that is really important about today's session is for us to recognize that there are a lot of different ways to think about issues of racism and colonialism in ISE research and methods. And indeed, I think the work in front of us as a field is to be careful about how we are approaching these issues, how we are thinking about engaging in work that claims to take up issues of racism and today we're going to change of perspectives and really hopefully start to put them in conversation with each other in ways that can hopefully illuminate and also push each other's work to consider the different paradigms and perspectives and experiences that we're working from. So I'm going to start by just asking each of the panelists to briefly introduce yourself. And by brief, I mean, tell us your name and where you're from. And I'd love to hear you talk a little bit about how it is that you think about issues of racism and colonialism in your work and why it's essentially important to you. So can I ask for Aisha, do you want to go first?
Sure, I'd be happy to go first. Good morning. My name is Aisha Boyce. I'm an associate professor at Arizona State University within the Division of Educational Leadership and Innovation. And ultimately, when I think about racism and colonialism in my everyday life and my work, racism is what this country was founded on. It's woven into the very fabric of our history. So ultimately, it shows up in my everyday life as an Afro-Latina woman. But it also shows up in my work. And so when I think about what it means in my work, I try to think about what it means to recognize that there's multiple kind of ontological and epistemological ways of knowing, so that there are multiple realities, that when I'm looking at outcomes, that ultimately there may be different outcomes for different participants, especially within these types of programming. But ultimately, when it comes down to methodology, recognizing that there are more than just randomized control trials as a way to know if something worked well or didn't work well. And so I think I'll have lots more to say about that, but I'll stop there so the other panelists can introduce themselves and get us started. I'm looking forward to being, and thank you for having me this morning.
Shireen, can I ask you to go next, and we'll see if we can figure out the sound for...
Hi, everyone. It's really wonderful to be in this amazing group of folks to have this conversation. So thank you for pulling this together. My name is Shireen Busuri. I'm an associate professor in learning sciences at Northwestern University. And I'll just build on what Aisha shared, and I'm imagining we might have more time to dig into this question. I think for me, questions of racism and colonialism have always been central to my kind of interest and concern with education and whether it is a process of reproducing the world as it is or a way of creating transformative possibilities for young peoples and communities to reach for a world free of various forms of supremacy. And so that's just what brings me to education as a field and as an educator. And I think particularly in the context of STEM, maybe I'll just plant a seed about this and then hopefully we can pick it up. I think as I moved from somebody who was very much in the social studies and literacy space as an educator and as a researcher into thinking about STEM and informal science education in particular, questions about access as the primary discourse of racial equity and justice became central to me. And I started to really wonder, along with others and learning from many of the folks here, about questions like access to what, for whom, and towards what ends. And those kinds of questions have been really central to the work that I've tried to do as a learning scientist, to think about racial justice and decolonization beyond ideas about access that don't actually interrogate the political and ethical dimensions of STEM learning. So I'll just pause there and pass it on and hope we can come back to that.
Shruti, do you want to try your audio again?
Hello, can you hear me?
Yeah.
All right, victory. My name is Shrutirahman. I have access to the platform, so thank you. Megan, it's such a pleasure to be here with you and Aisha, Shireen, Remy. Looking forward to this conversation. Like the rest of this group, Chicago Beyond, our purpose is really about freedom and equity. Unlike the others in this group, I'm not a researcher, so we are a funder of community-rooted work and a funder of research. And importantly, our roots are in community. Our founder was a high school principal on the south side of Chicago. And so, thinking about this conversation about racism and colonialism, it was an environment where children, because of racism, are recast as threatening. An environment where, community members were often the subjects of research, the objects of study, the recipients of aid, and rarely the power source, the strategist, the source of the epistemology. And so, we kind of came into this really seeing that funding and the way evidence gets produced operate in this symbiotic way that keeps that going. And in trying to build something different at Chicago Beyond, knew we kind of had to get at that directly because I think, as Aisha rightly said, it is the very founding of a number of systems, including clearly how money moves and how evidence gets made. And so, we came into it thinking, which now seems naive looking back, that if we could meaningfully fund access to different methodologies and for community-rooted work, Indigenous work, Black-led work, to have the means to produce research, that a different kind of knowledge could come forth and get to that freedom for people we loved. And I think I've learned that access is certainly important, but it is just the start. So we actually ended up writing this letter to ourselves, why am I always being researched? That has since, somewhat to our surprise, I think traveled to more than 90 countries, all 50 states. And it really has been a learning journey for us and a source of, I think, a lot of joy and a lot of just a chance to kind of return to humanness in all the many ways of knowing and bringing that into this work to get closer to what we set out to do in the first place. So happy to be here. And let's say a prayer that we get through the tech.
Great, thank you so much. Remy.
All right, Megan, thank you so much. Thank you for having me on this panel. Thank you, Case, too, for inviting me. I'm super honored to be here surrounded by so many thoughtful people. And for that reason, I'd like to articulate that my opinions are always forming and evolving as I learn from those around me and from my research participants. That said, these issues are important to me because they don't just represent ideas, they represent my own lived experiences, especially the idea of colonialism. I think that when we define colonialism in simple terms, for example, as a subjugation of people, their values, their ideas, we risk oversimplifying the complexities of the lived experience, especially of those who simultaneously face and embody forms of colonialist practices, especially in U.S. contexts. I think of a story shared to us by one of our research participants, really illustrates my current thinking. I'll name her Carla. Carla migrated to the U.S. from Colombia when she was about 7 or 8. And from a very young age, she was very interested in natural phenomena, very curious to learn about the world. And she remembered talking to her dad about the difference between thunder and lightning. She remembered her mom finding books for her that fed her science-related interests. And eventually her parents decided to move to the United States and migrate. And they explicitly communicated ideas and values around that decision that focused on her family's financial security, and social mobility. And those were intimately tied to the idea that Carla would go on to pursue higher education and specifically a career in a medical field. And this isn't true just for Carla, but for many immigrants to the U.S. and Carla grew up with these values. She accepted those values and ideas. And when she enrolled in college, she was on a pre-med track. And once in college, she attended physics classes, meeting other students who enjoyed physics as much as she did. She fell in love with the field, so much so that she decided to switch majors. This was a wonderful moment for Carla, but also a moment of great anxiety. She understood that her decision would create significant tension between her and her parents. And it would take a series of conversations to convince them of the appropriateness of the switch. And you might say that she had to subjugate their cultural values to her American values. I myself experienced similar tensions when I migrated to the US at around the same age that Carla did. I physically embody that tension as a descendant of Spanish colonists and people indigenous to Venezuela and Cuba. And I also embody that tension ideologically. As a child, I saw moving to the US as an opportunity for my family. The US was a symbol of prosperity and social mobility. But of course, once you live here, you recognize that like many other countries, there are inherent injustices embedded in our systems. But the symbol of what moving to the US meant to me didn't just go away, despite my growing efforts to counter social injustice. And so to this day, I live in that tension that appears in Carla's story, how she lived in that tension, recognizing that finding her passion in life also meant going against her parents' cultural values and the cultural values that she was raised with, facing that anxiety. And that placed Carla, in particular, at a great disadvantage compared to students who can switch to a non-medical STEM major without experiencing the need to confront and replace their family's cultural values. And so there's a tension there and a complexity that is nuanced. And I think understanding and recognizing that tension has been critical for me and for my research team to really kind of get at the experiences or study the experiences of our participants. And this has impacted everything from the way we think about these concepts to the way we carry out research, like the steps that we take, the way we engage participants. I'll leave it at that. I'm sure we'll engage more later. Thank you.
Yeah, well, I just want to appreciate the different layers that I feel like everyone just articulated. Appreciate it and think it's important to recognize that when we're thinking about these things, we are both thinking about the kind of long histories and foundings of what the kind of current social conditions we live in that I think Aisha was pointing to and others have pulled up. But I also really appreciate the complexity of navigating the kind of epistemic tensions that I'm hearing here, whether it's through our lived experiences and how those are always intersecting with our lives, or as Shruti, you're pointing out, the kinds of what I've referred to as kind of epistemic supremacies, whose knowledge systems and whose forms of making knowledge are recognized and seen as valid. And I think that part of what I'm also hearing is, Shireen, you're pushing us to think forward. One of the things that I really love that I think the four of you have just spoken to in different ways is really a sense that access isn't the aspiration, right? That actually access isn't a high enough goal. And in fact, if access alone is the goal, we might actually be agents in reproduction. And I want to make sure that I'm really that you all are saying that. And part of the reason I'm saying that is that I think it's important for everyone to understand that that's a bit of a paradigm shift, I would argue, in the ways that our field sometimes approaches issues of inequality. That for a long time we thought the problem was access, right? And there should be equitable access to things as they are. And part of what I really hear you all pushing on is, sure, we should have access and we should be able to navigate that. And we should be able to, Remy, I appreciate your story of Carla, because I think it also demonstrates that access to things as they are, really cool physics, is just fabulous. And if people want to choose that, people should do that. And that it sounds like there is some complexities in being able to create beyond things as they are, as deep issues of what it means to do kind of anti-colonial and anti-racist work. So I really appreciate this, and I wonder if you all could dig in a little bit, and maybe I'll ask Shruti and Shireen to start with this, and then perhaps others as they'd like. Can you dig in a little bit for us about what that is meant in practice, and what it looks like for you to take these values? I heard the word love, I think 3 times. I think I stopped counting after 3 times. But what it looks like in practice to do this, and potentially what that has meant for the kinds of partnerships. One of the beautiful things I think about this AISL meeting is that it's really an effort to elevate how are we in partnership and relationships, so that, as I think Remy and Shruti both pointed out, that people aren't objects to be studied, right? So we're in partner. In many ways, you could see that as an ethic of what it means to do research around these issues, period, or with people in general. But could you dig in a little bit, and maybe Shruti, I'll ask you to go first, about what's it look like in practice and what does it mean for partnership?
Thank you so much for the question, Megan, and for underlining the point that access is not enough, as we, learned the hard way. I want to start by talking about noticing, and noticing being an incredibly important piece of our practice, at least. And you might hear that and say, what do you mean noticing? I'm about action. I want to hear, like, what's the thing I need to go do? Or I don't have time for noticing. I live in the real world. But I think, as Megan is pointing out, that's where these things run really, really deep. And if we externalize and kind of say, like, I'm going to go work on racism and colonialism with the very best of intentions, we end up kind of rushing to, work on the race wealth gap in the name of doing something, without pausing to ask, whose definition of wealth are we working from? Right? We end up rushing to say, okay, lived experience. We're going to center lived experience and put all this well-intentioned effort into hiring the researcher with lived experience, or creating the committee or the council that has lived experience, or bringing it into the methodology, or shifting our methodology. And maybe at the end of the day, kind of find that while all of that has happened, the paradigm still feels uncannily more or less the same. And so to kind of get to that deeper shift, this practice of noticing has been so powerful, because I think we kind of it's allowed us to sort of stop saying this is something over there to go work on, and to say we are fundamentally a piece of this, and noticing ourselves as a part of this system, individually, organizationally, as a funder in research at every step along the way. And it has unleashed, I think, so much creativity in then, one thing leading to action, leading to trying something different, leading to something different. So, practically speaking, we've had situations where, we, the funder, are all about equity and freedom. The researchers are coming because they want to support what works. The community organization, community members are there because they've dedicated their lives and tears and blood to this work. And still finding ourselves in a situation where somehow the quote unquote valid metric really has more to do with what's tidy and distant and controllable, and can somehow be calculated in the absence of the actual context, and that still counts as rigor, right? Or finding ourselves in situations where, with the best of intentions, the kind of validated instrument is being used to assess, young Black non-resident fathers and, how that interaction is going. And then, this is where I think racism really comes up in that it allows a system to keep going where we can look at results of something and say, okay, it didn't work. Well, what did you expect? This was a failing school district anyway, right? Or this was this community anyway. And so I think the opportunity, and with Why Am I Always Being Researched, has really been through noticing to really get in that and to say, okay, what are the experiences that are being invisibilized here? What are the relational costs that are nowhere in the accounting that we as funders ought to be bearing, right? And truly, it allows us to stay on our dashboard like we, Chicago Beyond, we're the first row, right? We ourselves, like if we're about, funding, like truly where is the money actually going, not in whose name, but what economy are we actually watering? If this is about the creation of knowledge in service, like whose life is better in what way, according to whom, and actually in their lifetimes. And again, I think coming back to love, that I will mention again, since we've already lost count, it really has, we've seen kind of funders ourselves, clearly, which is where it all starts, researchers, community members, feeling like, we're doing some of the best work of our careers and the most authentic, because that noticing really allows, I think, getting to somewhere different in a way that tactical and like technical action itself just can't.
I really appreciate that, Shruti, and just the way that the conversation is unfolding. I'm just learning a lot, so thank you all. And I guess where I would kind of come into the conversation around access being insufficient is that I think there are ways in which our equity discourses have participated in the idea that what's good for white middle class kids is what's important for everybody, because of the kinds of inequities that have existed historically and ongoingly in this country. And so I just think it's important to kind of name that when we stay there, that there is a risk that we participate in an assimilationist project of education. And what I want to draw out is related to what Remy was sharing and others were sharing, which is that we don't ask questions about the cost and the harm to Black children, to Latinx children, to Indigenous children, to Asian American children, Middle Eastern children. Like, what happens when that is the fundamental paradigm for their experience in education, and what happens when their personhood is therefore denied in the intellectual work and the relationships that they're invited into. And so I think what's interesting to me about this conversation, and then I'll give an example, is that it feels to me like the term access has already been co-opted in that paradigm, because I can get behind access to humanizing, environments that invite multiple ways of knowing, that connect to students' families and cultural life worlds. So part of this conversation is making me want to reclaim the word access a little bit and think about, like, what could access actually mean if we move from a different paradigm? So I'll just offer that. And then the example that I'll give that I think speaks to the partnership work is a partnership that we've had for a number of years with a out-of-school STEAM-based program that serves Black and Latinx middle school youth, sixth graders. And there was a particular summer and a particular day early in our partnership where the kids were invited to do drone racing and to engage with drones. And right after the day, so they had fun, they engaged with drones, and so from one perspective, that's like good STEAM learning, right? Good access to technological kind of expertise and knowledge, cutting edge technologies, that kind of thing. And for me, as an Iranian educator and researcher, like I had questions about like, what are we implicitly teaching when we engage with drones without having a critical conversation about militarism or surveillance? And I think this speaks to the earlier conversation about the relationship between STEM and empire, and the relationship between STEM and colonialism, and the harms that have been enacted on communities of color in the US and around the world, and how our young people are privy to that. And so when we don't engage in those conversations, I think we're actually engaging in a much less rigorous kind of STEM education. And so in this particular case, the next day, we opened up a conversation. We shared some understandings around the role of drones in militarism. And we had a conversation with, 11-year-olds about inventions that hurt people and inventions that help people. And we put up on the board, like, let's brainstorm. What are some inventions that help people? What are some inventions that hurt people? And had this conversation. And one of the things that came out of it that stood really prominently in my mind is that the kids started to trouble our binary, and they put these words on the middle line. It was like, drugs. Well, drugs are sometimes medicine that help people, and sometimes they are unhealthy and harm people, right? And a young Black student said the Constitution as an invention that goes on the middle line, right? And so the reason I just share this example is for two points that I think connect to this, which is that number one, I think we need to refuse the idea that one way of knowing that aligns with the settled curriculum of STEM is rigor. And I think we need to really open that up to think about how when you engage kids' lives and when you engage in multiple ways of knowing, there's an intellectual depth and complexity that comes forward. And there's an understanding of the world on the part of children and youth that comes forward that I think is the kind of learning that many of us are invested in nourishing. And number two, I think that story also helps us think about how it's not about getting it right politically or even educationally from the outset. It is about engaging with partners in a process of co-thinking and ongoing examination of what we're putting forward in our designs and our pedagogy and what kids are bringing and opens up in the learning that allows us to evolve continuously together to do the work of like, okay, what does that mean for tomorrow? Like, can we open up a conversation, And even going on from that, there's a question of like, how do we open these critical conversations in a way that doesn't stay in just critique, but offers young people opportunities for imagination and like concrete hope and possibility. And I think that's a really important tension. So I'll just end by saying that I think a stance of ongoing critical reflection, I think this connects to Shruti's point about noticing, and a relational context of partnership that is about co-thinking together, and we can talk more about that, I think opens up different possibilities for how rigor gets defined with children and young people as well.
Yeah, thank you, both of you. I hope everyone else is experiencing also a kind of deep wonder about the potentials when we think carefully and we recognize the complexities of kind of everyday, but also how we're thinking about STEM. And I'm wondering, Aisha, if you would talk to us a little bit about how you've shifted, and perhaps riffing off the last pieces, but also how have you changed the way that you think about STEM more broadly? But also, I'd love for us to talk a little bit about what it means for the ways that your methods for conducting ISE research have evolved or shifted.
Excellent. Thank you so much. So I am a STEM program evaluator, and I also conduct educational research. And so I think this really fits in well with how I think about all of this. I'm someone who likes to work in lists. So I think there's kind of 4 key ways that I've tried to think about this. And if you Google my name, I have a couple of blog posts and articles about this. But I think there's 4 ways to think about this. And before you can get to kind of the methodological points, there's kind of 3 things to think about ahead of that, right? So the first is recognizing that social inquiry is a cultural product. So this idea that we're going to be value neutral, or that our own opinions are not going to somehow show up because we're going to control out for them, is a fallacy. Like, that's not a real thing. So as we first kind of think well about this, knowing that any products that we do, anytime that we produce reports, a part of ourselves show up in that, or the culture that we live in, or society we live in. Like, so recognizing that when we're reading reports or producing our own reports or doing our own research, that's really important. The second is we need to take some time to locate our own values, prejudice, and identities. Hazel Simonet has said that, as researchers, as evaluators, we are the first instrument, right? So all of our own thoughts and biases show up. So we need to interrogate that and really be thoughtful about that. And then that we also need to really think about attending to issues of culture, equity, and diversity, and inclusivity formally and informally in our work, right? And so informally, it's in the conversations that we're having, it's in how we're interpreting the results. And then formally, it's making sure that we have really explicit questions, research questions and evaluation questions about diversity, equity, and inclusion, and making sure that we're developing and utilizing indicators and metrics around DEI. So right now I'm conducting some research within the Advanced Technological Education Program funded by NSF around how evaluators and PIs measure and attend to diversity, equity, and inclusion. And one of the things that's coming out of this research is that people throw around terms like DEI, diversity, equity, inclusion, but really what they're talking about is diversity. And when we ask them to kind of separate out equity and inclusivity, especially when it's how they measure equity and inclusivity, that this is more difficult to do and that they're not doing it as much. And my guess is that this extends throughout kind of all STEM program evaluators. So one thing is making sure that instead of kind of smushing all of these words together, that we're really thinking about equity and inclusivity. I think someone touched on this in terms of access. We are doing a disservice if we're increasing diversity within the field, giving more opportunities to and broadening participation, but we're not thinking about inclusivity, right? Like, we're not thinking about the chilly climate. We're not thinking about and measuring the impacts and disaggregating data. In terms of, so once I've kind of thought about these things, and when I think about from a methodological perspective, once I've ensured that I'm attending to not just diversity, but equity and inclusivity, and thinking about what would that look like? How would I know it when I see it? I think it's really important that we use a variety of instruments, that we use a variety of methods so that we can triangulate and have multiple perspectives looking at the same phenomena, right? And I appreciate what Shruti was talking about was these instruments. I want to say one additional thing about that. It's really important, and I know that our funder wants us to use validated instruments. But when we think about being ensuring that we're using instruments that are culturally commensurate, if an instrument that has been validated with a certain population, and then we take that instrument to a different population, that instrument is no longer valid. I think sometimes we get really worried about changing questions or manipulating instruments. But if they don't, if the population that we're utilizing the instrument on doesn't understand the instrument, or if it doesn't resonate with them, then all of your validity has gone and rigor has gone out the door in the first place. And so we get really nervous about tweaking instruments. I also think in terms of methodologically, I think it's also important that we use a variety of methods. So one method that I've been using in my projects has been photo voice, which is where I have participants go and take pictures about what it's like to be their experience and what it's like to be in their own skin, versus me saying, okay, well, here's how we define sense of belonging, and now you tell me, how you're going to answer these questions. Or here's how we define science identity. So now you go answer the survey, and I'm going to see what your science identity. This has really allowed us within this project, which has been really cool, to have students go and take pictures of, like, you tell me, what does it mean to be a scientist as an undergraduate student? Or you tell me as a high school student who's attending this program, what does this program mean to you? And they take their own pictures. And so then we go in and we interpret that. And that has been really rich. I think we've paired that with, other traditional methods like interviews and focus groups and assessments. And then finally, I think it's also really important that we take an anti-deficit orientation, right? So instead of, I think sometimes we take this perspective of, wow, this group this particular group, there's not as many people in STEM. So what can we do? What can we throw at them? What resources can we give them to make them better, or make them, to try to make them more interested? And part of it is we need to look and say, well, what's wrong with this particular field? What's going on with this particular department, this particular unit, that people don't feel comfortable here? A great example is that I did a climate study for a project, and we were looking, and we found out that students who were not white were having a slightly different experience than their white counterparts. Not necessarily having a bad experience, but they were not having as good of an experience. And when I presented this information to the principal investigators, they said, well, I know exactly what's going on here. The students who come from this background don't know what it means to be in a STEM field. They don't have as much background on, what to experience, what it's like to be in this major. And I said, well, that may be it. It wasn't that. We did follow-up interviews. That may be it, but maybe instead of saying like what's wrong with them and why they're not having a good of experience, maybe there is something that can be changed within the project, or there's something that can be changed within the department to ensure that everyone can have a similar experience to each other. And so I think those are kind of some initial ways that I think about this within my own methodology and when I'm thinking about this work.
I really love this. I think there's a series of things that I just heard that I kind of want to debate. That I think that sometimes when we have these conversations, we don't recognize that I actually think this is the edges of new paradigm view, right? That recognize that human learning and development is moving across time, and that actually we are asking deep questions about our forms of data that we need that actually help us accomplish the goals and ends that we're after. So I think it's really important for people to hear that while we want some forms of rigor, there is a theoretical and context validity rigor that in some ways has either never been there, I would argue, in the ways that we talk about and think about rigor. And I really appreciate this anti-deficit perspective, because I think it's connected to the problems of access alone, or access to things as are, right? If we have paradigms where we're measuring individuals that we're constructing as the explanation for inequality is located in those individuals that don't participate in the systems as they are, it sets in motion program design, evaluation design, research design with particular paradigms and particular perspectives on folks. And I think, just to say, right, where we started this conversation was a view of history and the unfolding of social communities and trying to make sense of that historicity in relation to experience. So I just want to elevate, right, that you all have just said, here is this, it demands us to know something about our history as social communities, as human communities. And it makes us have to have a kind of attention or a noticing to the details of interaction and teaching and learning in ways that are very layered and complicated in order to do the kinds of shifts in rigor that you're talking about. And I guess mostly because I can't ever not say this these days. One of the things that I also hear is really interesting to me, and I would invite people to say things, is that I spend a lot of time in my work thinking about how coloniality has created what I talk about in my work as a sense of human supremacy, and in the United States, white human supremacy, as the paradigm for measurement and action. And one of the things that I think becomes interesting in this conversation is how we're continually interrogating the settled assumptions in our constructs and how it is that we view change, particularly when we start thinking about, I really appreciate, Shimeen, you're talking about young people's awareness. Young people are pretty aware that climate change is really, really real, and most adults have not moved very fast, right? And in many ways, what I'm getting at there is that young people are aware and do not seem to be as engaged in a deeply human-centric awareness about the world and its needs in a way that I find very promising. But I often feel like, as frankly adults working in design, we tend to replicate a kind of human-centered assumption rather than in humans in relationships or in partnership with. And I think that there are, as we continue, right, and I often tell a story about how I've done that a bajillion times in the last 20 years in ways that I'm like, God, I'm thinking about this, and I still replicated it in this design of X, Y, or Z things. So that I'm always trying to do what I think Shireen put on the table about trying, recognizing how we're playing forward parts of a kind of racist ideology or a colonial ideology, and continuing to grow towards being able to do that reflective work. And I wonder, as I'm going to try to kind of push towards our next question, and Remy, I'm going to put you on the spot a little bit to take up this next question because you articulated it, is I've heard that you articulated there's a kind of tension of um, embodying some of the things that were challenging, but also coming into this. I once heard the story of, what does it mean? How can you both love yourself if you really understand the history of your becoming, when you've been a part of these things, from both as colonized and colonizer, as another way of saying that. And I heard you articulate that. So I guess the question is, can you all kind of talk about what is both challenging and rewarding about this work, and what challenges in doing this you're navigating? And I guess I'll inflect that a little bit with, when I partner with lots of different types of organizations, the kind of local constraints or the perceived constraints on them often are often a kind of challenge to see how to do this work. And I just wonder if you might talk a little bit about that, what's been difficult and what's been rewarding, and how you're navigating the challenges.
Thank you for the question, Megan. I'll speak from the perspective of research, though I think this is a topic that's maybe a little bit easier for practitioners to kind of get, wrap their minds around. For research, at least from my perspective, the first challenge came with becoming aware of how that idea that you presented of being both colonized and the colonizer, and becoming aware that my entry into STEM and STEM education research required kind of making the gatekeepers happy with my performances so that I can enter those communities. And those communities were historically designed and built by Western white men. And so walking into those communities, adopting their values so that I am equally validated in their eyes. And then when it's my turn to review somebody's proposal or paper or whatever, that's my opportunity to either reproduce those values or to accept and adopt different ways of thinking about research. And not just that, but maybe more importantly, different ways of thinking about what matters. Because we, we all recognize when there are trends, particularly like in STEM ed research, right? Trends and hot topics, right? And those trends and those hot topics matter, but what else matters? And I want to make sure that every opportunity I get to review or to think about something that somebody presents that doesn't fit those trends or that doesn't fit those hot topics gets a fair opportunity from me as a reviewer. And sometimes, we don't think about our role as reviewers, and I'm thinking in this case both manuscript reviewers and grant funding reviewers. Sometimes we don't think about the importance of that role in terms of how it shapes what gets funded and what gets published and whose voices get heard. So I take those roles seriously because they have an impact not just on me and my work, but on the community as a whole. But where I struggle is, what have I yet to learn about myself in terms of the colonizing practices that I'm enacting? And I think that's, we've brought up epistemology and ontology, this idea of, the nature of knowledge and the nature of being. But I don't know if we've yet tackled the idea of axiology, which is that the ethics of what we do.
Yeah, I so appreciate that. And I'm thinking about time, and I want to kind of scrap our next question and move to the one that I'm excited to hear from each of you about. And to pick up Remy's point about this, I mean, I think you all have articulated you all come to this work with a kind of axiology, a kind of ethics. And I wonder if you might talk a little bit about the edges of work and where you are headed or where you hope to see the field. And I wonder if you could vibe with Remy's point about what are the ethics or the axiology that you're hoping to see emerge in the field. And maybe Shruti, could you go first with that?
Sure. I really appreciate that point, Remy. Thank you. I think, maybe building on the earlier conversations about this sense of reflection of self and the sense of journey and progression, and each day, as Shireen was giving voice to, looking at it, learning, moving to the next, and thinking of that as rigor. Just as we're reclaiming access in this panel, thinking of that as a rigor that is truly free of force, right? A rigor that is free of knowledge supremacy, as opposed to saying, anything that is rigorous necessarily has force and knowledge supremacy built in. And that there's an ethical point in that. And then in practicing it, I think for us, that practice of noticing, and also the practice of connection, and how are these things like infrastructurally built in, so that the ethics, are both a question of kind of individual reflection and also part of how, as an organization, as a funder, we move. So for one of those edges for us, really has been, how do we continually step further into that idea of, whose voice, whose epistemology, is the power source, who are the strategists, not just by having, community committees stapled somewhere, but, and also doing it in a way that we're not, pulling people out of work, out of the block they're on, in order to serve some ego or some performance of, being, community oriented or listening or educating the funder, which I think also very easily happens. So I think really moving with that and doing it gently and lovingly, and with that, what I define as actual rigor of truly, reflecting constantly, so that each day is better than the last. And then one other thing I will say, just as a note of encouragement, I think, is part of how these things, I think, maybe co-opt us into reproducing them, is this sense of powerlessness that I have seen kind of come up for all of us at every single seat. I've heard it from community members, who feel, well, the nonprofits got, the power. I've heard it from nonprofits who feel like the researchers got the power. I've heard it from researchers who feel the funders got the power. I've heard it from the funder program officer who feels their board members got the power. I've heard it from the board member, or the government entity who feels like, well, what can I do because I have to be a good steward of funds? I have to be a good fiduciary. And how do I do that if I'm not evidence-based, right? And so, I say this kind of in humor, but it is literally true that I've literally followed these chains. And so NSF, if you're out there, please let's talk, because these are things where it is also true that each of us, wherever we sit, there is something that may feel small. It may not feel like it's upending the whole system and undoing colonialism and racism by just pulling on the thread. But it is truly incredible, kind of the humanness, the opportunity to step into many ways of knowing, the joy of the real rigor of holding ourselves, accountable to one another as beings, human or otherwise, as part of this ecosystem, and taking that really seriously as a discipline. So I just invite and encourage all of us to find those things, and not let ourselves get sucked into, well, someone else actually has the power. So thank you.
I appreciate that. Aisha, do you want to tell us about your edges and what you hope for the field?
Sure. I mean, I hope for everything that we are kind of talking about today to just be mainstream, for it to not be a separate, like, oh, that's those social justice folks, or that's those folks who think about cultural responsiveness, or, I would argue that ultimately it's our moral imperative to think well about this work. It's important that our work reflect the values that we want to see, and that we want a more just society, and so that we should be including those type of values in our own work. And so ultimately, I hope that this is what ends up being the future. And as Shruti has said, this is just what we see. This is everyone kind of does their small part, whether it's, the program implementer who sees a microaggression happening to one of their participants, and they take that up and interrogate that, and all the way to the way that researchers and evaluators think about the type of instruments that we use and the way that we actually engage with and define and measure all the constructs that we kind of talked about today: equity, diversity, anti-racism, and that is just actually embedded into the work that we do, and it's not an add-on. So I'll stop there. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Remy, what's the edges and where do you hope we're going?
I love listening to what the panelists are saying. Thank you so much, all. But so in terms of the edges, for me, I think of I think of my family. My family is a blended family, and one of our mottos that we continue to remind each other is two words, very simple. It's people first. No matter how stressed you are, no matter what you're going through, there's no excuse to treat anybody as less than, so always people first. And I think in a much bigger, maybe much more impactful way, that's something that as a community of informal learning researchers and practitioners, we need to keep in mind. What does that mean for us to put people first, to put others first? What does it mean to create spaces where multiple identities can coexist? In the same way that we might have a room that's full of people, and somebody else wants to join, and we might scoot over and try to make space for them. What does that look like in terms of allowing different ways of being in science to come into the space? I think that's, at least for me, that's what is at the edges.
Thank you. Shireen.
Yeah, I wish we had heart emojis so I could keep adding those every time people spoke. I'm really appreciating this. I wanted to speak to something Remy said earlier about axiology and connect it to partnership work, given the work that I know a lot of people in the audience are engaged in. And I want to think about axiologies of knowledge production in community engaged research and participatory research. And I guess what I mean by that is building on what Aisha said about, anti-deficit views, I think that one of the edges of our field, as we move more into research practice partnerships and away from research on people and research with people, is the need for a greater anti-deficit view of practitioners and families and young people in their participation in the research process. And part of what I mean by that is something I've been wrestling with a lot the last couple of years, is something I heard Jay Lemke once say, which is, it's not just a question of who's at the table, but it's a question of what kind of table is it? And I think that our field has made strides in who is at the table, and that an important edge is what kind of table is it? And so part of what that has meant for me is how are we actually creating spaces that disrupt some of the reifications of roles that can come in? So sometimes what ends up happening is, and people have probably heard this, is people will go like, okay, now we need the youth voice. Now we need the practitioner voice. And part of what that does is actually reify people into one tokenized way of knowing that actually delimits the kind of democratizing of knowledge production that I think we're after. And an alternative to that is to really think about what are the conditions for co-design and co-analysis of STEM learning environments that are reaching for equity and justice, that allows for people to engage in a kind of shared knowledge production over time. And I think I'll just end by saying that the way I think this connects to our earlier conversation about colonialism is that we have these colonial ideas about who does research and who does design, and where and how those things take shape. And I think disrupting that through a kind of deep relationship building allows for people to think together across adults and kids, across researchers and educators, and to bring their multiple roles. And it also allows people to push each other with love when it's necessary, when these things start to get reified around race and other forms of hierarchy. And I think a really exciting edge of our field is if we can dig into that relational work and those conditions at the table, what kind of multi-layered knowledge production about STEM equity becomes possible?
Well, I feel like we've just gotten this conversation started. And to the panelists here, I just want to say I'm so grateful. I appreciate you all coming to this conversation in the way that you have. And I hope for the audience listening, one of my favorite things about folks really doing this work is the kind of humility and honesty that I think you each have drawn forward from yourselves and tried to put in motion in the world. And I guess I'll just say that I think that it reminds me a lot of one of kind of my deepest mentors and heroes in the world is Vine Deloria, who talked about that we're in a time of human maturation, or at least he hoped we were, that human communities needed to learn how to be better humans with one another. And I just want to say thank you all for walking that walk. It's part of what I can see in each of your work and the way that you are talking and engaging with each other. And I hope that's an invitation to our ISE community. And part of the reason I want to say that is that I've always been really pleasantly surprised about the potential innovations in ISE to lead what education could mean much more broadly than sometimes just the way that we think about it in informal. So I just want to leave by saying thank you to you all and invite the rest of our field listening to continue to lean in to both the humility and humanity that I think you all have modeled for us, but also the deep rigor and the potential for us to lead the field more broadly. So miigwech, and looking forward to further conversation.